The wind cut across the vast plains like a restless ghost, carrying the dry scent of sagebrush and distant smoke. The sun hung low, painting the horizon in streaks of crimson and gold, as if the sky itself could not decide whether it wanted to burn or bleed. In the small, forgotten town of Red Mesa, people whispered about a man who had arrived without warning, a shadow with eyes like burning amber, a presence that stirred unease in the hearts of those who dared glance his way. They said he was a monster, a man who carried his past like a hidden knife, ready to strike when least expected. But the whispers never told the truth, never revealed what lingered beneath the layers of silence and scars. Only a few could see the truth, and even fewer could understand it. He rode into town alone, his horse steady despite the rough terrain, hooves kicking up clouds of dust that lingered long after he passed. His name was Tokoda, a warrior of the Apache, carrying a legacy heavier than the saddle on his back, his face weathered and lined with the storms of a life lived on the edge of survival. Showed no warmth, yet there was a strange pull in his gaze, as if he had seen both the beauty and cruelty of the world, and had chosen to bear it silently.
Oh.
The people of Red Mesa watched him from behind shuttered windows, from the edges of creaking porches, and felt a chill, as if his arrival had awakened something they had long tried to forget. In the same town, under the shadow of a collapsing church steeple, lived another soul, just as fractured, though in a different way. Her name was Alara, a woman whose heart had been shattered by betrayals she could not speak of, whose hands bore the calluses of endless labor, yet trembled with a longing she did not dare name. She moved through the town like a whisper of sorrow, a shadow among shadows, carrying a grief that made her almost untouchable. The townsfolk pitied her, but avoided her gaze, sensing the storm that hid behind her quiet demeanor. Her life had been a series of losses, each one a jagged stone in the riverbed of her existence, and she had learned to keep her pain locked away, as though revealing it might invite another cruelty she could not survive. The first time Takoda and Alara's paths crossed, it was under circumstances neither could have anticipated. A fire had broken out at the edge of town, threatening the few homes clustered around the trading post. People ran screaming, but Takoda moved with a calm precision, guiding frightened children and elderly townsfolk to safety. Moving through the flames as though he belonged to the fire itself, Alara had been trapped near the smoke-choked stable, unable to move, paralyzed by fear and memories that clawed at her from the past. Takoda found her, lifting her with an ease that belied his strength, his amber eyes meeting hers in a gaze that seemed to pierce through the walls she had built around her heart. In that moment, a silent promise was made, not with words. For both had learned that words were often hollow but with an understanding deeper than speech. Takoda's presence was a shield, Alara's trust a fragile gift. And though neither could know it then, that single, unspoken connection would bind them together in ways that would defy the unforgiving world around them. The town of Red Mesa, for all its dusty streets and creaking signs, had a history of its own, whispered in hushed tones in the saloon and the church, in the jailhouse where iron bars could not contain the sins of the past. Takoda understood that history better than most. It was written in scars on his arms, in the quiet anger that simmered beneath his calm exterior. Alara, too, carried her history like a shadow, one that followed her even when she tried to run, one that left her restless nights and trembling hands. Together, they were two broken pieces of a world that had long forgotten how to heal, and the first sparks of their connection hinted at something neither had dared hope for, the possibility of redemption, of something stronger than pain. Night fell quickly over the plains, the wind carrying with it the cries of coyotes and the faint echo of a distant river. Takoda's horse grazed near the edge of town, and he sat on a weathered ridge, watching the town lights flicker like distant fireflies. His thoughts were as restless as the wind, circling memories of battles fought, friends lost, and a life that had demanded more than it ever gave. Alara walked past the ridge later, drawn by something she could not name, and when she stopped a few paces away, neither spoke. The silence was not empty. It was filled with questions, fears, and the unspoken knowledge that their lives were about to change forever. There was an old legend in Red Mesa, one that children dared each other to whisper at night. It told of a wandering warrior who would appear in times of greatest despair, a figure who could bring either salvation or ruin depending on the heart of the one he encountered. The townspeople had laughed at it for years, but now, as Takuda moved through the streets, carrying burdens unseen and memories unspoken, the legend seemed less like a story and more like a warning. And Alara, standing at the edge of her past and the unknown future, felt that warning in her bones, yet could not step back. There was something magnetic about him, something that pulled at the broken edges of her soul and promised that she was not alone in her suffering. The air between them held tension, not of anger or conflict, but of anticipation, a fragile thread stretched taut across the emptiness of their lives. Every glance, every measured step, every flicker of expression carried weight. Both had learned to survive on their own, to trust only in themselves, yet in that quiet understanding they found a strange comfort. It was a comfort that frightened them, for it meant opening the doors they had kept locked for years, and neither knew if the world would allow them to keep that small, fragile flame alive. The first night of their meeting ended with no words, no promises spoken aloud, only a shared gaze under the burning stars, a silent acknowledgement that fate had placed them together. In the distance, the howl of a lone wolf broke the stillness, reminder that the plains were unforgiving and that every choice carried consequence. Tokuda and Alara did not speak of what had passed or what would come, for silence in that moment was their language, and it said more than any words ever could. But Red Mesa had its own rhythm, and the calm of that night was deceptive. Shadows moved where the moonlight failed to reach, and whispers carried secrets that could unravel even the strongest resolve. Tokuda knew that his past was not done with him, that old enemies and unfinished battles would not wait for him to heal. Alara understood that her scars were not invisible, that the world would test the fragile trust she had begun to place in someone who seemed as broken and as whole as she was. And so the stage was set, a town full of secrets, two souls bound by a silent promise, and a horizon that promised fire, sorrow, and perhaps in time, something that could be called hope. As dawn approached, painting the skies with the first pale light of day, Takuda rode toward the ridge where he had first found Alara, leaving a trail of dust in his wake. She waited at the edge, her breath shallow, her pulse quickened, not from fear, but from anticipation. The wind whispered through the tall grass, carrying the scent of change and the quiet weight of what was yet to come. Neither could know the trials that lay ahead, nor the demons that would rise from the shadows to test their bond.
Damn.
But in that fleeting moment, beneath the awakening sun, a spark had been lit, a silent promise that would endure, even as the world threatened to tear everything apart. The plains held their breath, the town slept uneasily, and the two figures, bound by something neither fully understood, faced a horizon that demanded courage, sacrifice, and the willingness to trust a soul as broken as their own. And as Tokuda and Alara disappeared into the rising light, neither saw the figure watching from the far ridge, cloaked in shadow, whose intentions were as unknown as the wind that carried them both forward. The story was only beginning, and the promise, silent yet unyielding, had set their destinies in motion. The figure on the ridge remained motionless, a silhouette against the rising sun, watching Takuda and Alara as they disappeared over the undulating plains. There was a cold precision in the way he observed them, as if he had waited years for this exact moment. His name was Corvin, and he carried a reputation that moved ahead of him like a storm. Men feared him, women whispered his name, and children were told stories of his cunning and ruthlessness to keep them close to hearth and home. He had no loyalty to town, kin, or law, only to the shadows that had shaped him. And now he watched the two souls intertwined by a promise he did not yet understand, calculating the ways their presence could either serve him or be destroyed. Takuda's horse moved steadily, ears twitching at every rustle of dry grass. He was aware of eyes, of shadows that clung too closely to the edges of vision, but he did not flinch. His instincts, honed by years of survival in lands that would devour the unprepared, kept him alert yet controlled. Alara walked beside him, her eyes scanning the distant hills with caution. Despite her frailty in the eyes of the townsfolk, she carried a strength born of hardship, one that even Tokuda recognized immediately. There was a silent rhythm to her movements, a rhythm that suggested resilience forged in fire, grief that refused to break her entirely. They had ridden only a few miles when Tokuda finally spoke, his voice low and steady, the words shaped as much by thought as necessity. "You should know," he said, glancing at her from the corner of his eye. "The wind carries more than dust here. carries echoes. The plains have memory. Every shadow hides a story. Alara nodded without responding. She understood more than he realized. Every loss she had suffered, every betrayal she had endured, had taught her to read the silence between words, the spaces in gestures, the truth in glances. She felt, deep in her chest, that Tokuda's words were not just warning, but invitation. Invitation to see, to listen, and perhaps to trust. Their journey led them to the edge of a narrow canyon, its walls etched with centuries of erosion, its floor littered with stones that whispered when disturbed. Here, the world felt older, heavier, as if every grain of sand carried a secret. Tokuda dismounted and gestured for Alara to do the same. "This place," he said quietly, "it has witnessed more than any town ever could. Blood, fire, betrayal, even hope. And the spirits of those who walked it before still linger." Alara's gaze swept the canyon, noting the hollows and shadows. It was quiet, but the quiet felt alive, as if listening, judging, waiting. She shivered not from cold, but from the awareness that they were stepping into a space older than either of them. A space that had its own rules and its own memory of human failings. Tokuda's presence reassured her, but only just. She was aware, instinctively, that something was coming. Something unseen. The history of Red Mesa and the surrounding plains was not easily told. It was stitched together from fragments of old battles between settlers and tribes. From families torn apart by fire and blood, from laws enforced with gun and intimidation rather than justice. Tokuda knew much of this history firsthand, not just as observer but as participant. His people, the Apache, had been scattered, hunted, and misunderstood. His father had taught him early that survival demanded more than courage. It demanded knowledge of human weakness, the patience to watch, the strength to endure. And now, walking beside Alara, he recognized the same survival instincts mirrored in her, even if she did not yet see them herself. Night fell sooner than expected, bringing with it a blanket of stars that seemed closer to the earth here, as if the heavens were leaning in to watch. They made camp in a small hollow just off the trail, where a trickle of water ran over rounded stones. Tokuda set to work quietly, arranging firewood and keeping the flames small and controlled. Alara unpacked her few belongings, her movements precise and deliberate. She noticed Tokuda's attention to detail, his quiet awareness of the sounds and shadows around them. It was the kind of vigilance that came from having seen too much and trusting too little, and it gave her both comfort and unease. Around the fire, neither spoke at length. Their silence was not awkward. It was charged, filled with a strange energy neither of them could name. It was as if the world had narrowed down to this flickering circle of light, and everything beyond it, every danger, every memory, every shadow had been postponed at least for the moment. Tokuda's amber eyes flicked toward the canyon's edge repeatedly, scanning for movement, for anything out of place. He did not speak of Corvin, though he felt the weight of that figure somewhere beyond the ridges. He did not yet reveal the enemies he had made, the paths he had walked in solitude. Alara, in turn, felt the pulse of her own past unspoken grief, the betrayals that had hardened her heart, and the question of whether she could ever trust again. The fire cast long shadows across their faces, highlighting lines of worry, weariness, and determination. Alara finally spoke, her voice soft but firm. "I've always lived with ghosts. They don't leave, no matter how far you run." Tokuda studied her, seeing not just the pain in her words but the resilience beneath it. "Then perhaps," he said, "we can learn to walk together, even with ghosts at our heels." Her eyes met his, and for a fleeting moment, the wind carried a sense of understanding, fragile but undeniable. Yet even as the night deepened, a sense of unease crept along the edges of the canyon. Somewhere hidden in shadow, eyes watched. Every snap of a twig, every distant howl carried weight. They were not alone, and the world beyond the fire was alive with possibility and threat alike. Tokuda's thoughts drifted to the enemies he had made over years of battles, both fought and avoided. There were men who would kill without hesitation, who would see his connection to Alara as weakness and strike accordingly. And there were forces older, quieter, more patient forces that played a long game, that understood the cost of pain and loss. He knew that the silent promise between him and Alara, however fragile, would be tested, and yet in the flickering firelight he could not turn away from it. Elara sat close, hands warmed by the fire, and wondered at the strange certainty she felt in Tokoda's presence. She had always believed that the world would crush what was soft, what was vulnerable. Yet here with him, she felt a strange defiance stirring within her. It was a small spark, but enough to make her heart race. Enough to make her imagine if, only for a moment, that survival might not have to be lonely. That trust might not always bring ruin. But the wind whispered again, carrying a sense of movement from the ridges above. Tokoda stiffened, one hand resting on the hilt of a knife hidden beneath his coat. Elara noticed, her pulse quickening, the firelight flickering in her eyes. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the hollow, a figure moved, deliberate, patient, silent. Tokoda did not yet name the threat, did not yet speak of Corvin, but he could feel the tension tightening, could feel the history of the plains pressing against them. The night seemed endless, the fire a fragile barrier against the unknown. Every sound was magnified, the rustle of grass, the distant cry of a coyote, the snap of a branch under some hidden weight. Both Tokoda and Elara understood that dawn might not bring safety, that the plains did not forgive, that the story of their lives was far from written.
Ow.
The promise made in silence still held, but the world beyond it was unpredictable, harsh, and relentless. As the fire burned lower, they sat in quiet vigilance, aware of the mysteries waiting in the dark. The canyon seemed to breathe around them, alive with the memory of those who had passed through before, alive with danger and with possibility. The wind shifted, carrying scents of smoke and dust. Tokoda's eyes narrowed, catching the faint outline of a figure at the canyon's edge, waiting, measuring. Elara felt it too, the silent presence that was neither friend nor foe, but something that would change everything if it chose to intervene. And in that moment, as the first faint light of dawn began to brush the horizon, both understood a truth they could not yet voice. The plains were alive. Their pasts were not done with them, and the silent promise that bound them together would be tested in ways neither had imagined. The story of Tokoda and Elara, of a warrior and a broken soul, had only begun, and the shadows were already gathering. Dawn broke with a pale, almost reluctant light, casting long shadows across the canyon floor. Tokoda and Elara had stayed vigilant through the night, neither daring to close their eyes fully. The wind shifted again, carrying scents of sage, dust, and something less identifiable, smoke from a distant fire or a presence watching them. They could not be certain. Tokoda mounted his horse with quiet deliberation, every movement measured, attuned to the rhythm of danger that always lurked near. Elara followed, her hand brushing the strap of her small satchel where she carried a few personal items and a knife for protection. Though fragile in appearance, she had a courage tempered by loss and survival, a courage that matched Tokoda's own, though he did not say so aloud. They moved along the canyon trail, silent except for the crunch of stones beneath hooves and boots. Tokoda's senses were alive to every sound, every shift in the wind, while Elara's eyes darted to the ridges. Noting places where someone or something might be watching, they were not alone. He could feel it, the weight of unseen eyes, and his instincts screamed at him to prepare for confrontation. The plains had taught him patience, but patience did not mean ignorance. Meanwhile, Corvin remained on the ridge, observing. He had tracked Tokoda for days, waiting for the right moment to make his presence known. Corvin's mind moved like a chessboard. Each step of Tokoda and Elara plotted, each reaction anticipated. He did not approach yet. He did not strike. First, he wanted to understand the bond between them, the silent promise that had drawn two broken souls together. Corvin had no interest in sentiment. He was a man defined by strategy and survival. And now, more than ever, he recognized that Tokoda was a threat not just because of skill, but because of this connection. Corvin could destroy one, could destroy both. But timing, as always, was crucial. The canyon opened onto a narrow valley where wild grasses swayed in the early morning light. Tokoda slowed his horse and gestured for Elara to do the same. He dismounted and surveyed the area, scanning for tracks, for subtle signs of ambush. "The plains tell stories," he said quietly, voice carrying over the whispering grasses. "They speak of those who passed this way, those who died, those who watched. Someone has followed us. I can feel it." Elara's hand tightened on her satchel. "Do you think it's the man from the ridge?" she asked. She did not use his name, but both understood who she meant. Tokoda nodded slowly. "Yes. He is patient. He waits for weakness. We cannot give him that. Not now, not ever. As they moved further into the valley, the tension of their journey deepened. Dakota shared fragments of the land's history with LRS stories of skirmishes between settlers and Apache warriors, families torn apart by greed and violence, of betrayals that had left scars on the earth itself. Each story was more than history. It was a warning. Every betrayal carried consequences, and every misstep could mean death. Elara listened, absorbing each word, understanding that these stories were not just lessons, but maps of survival. In the distance, a small settlement appeared, half hidden among rocky outcrops and twisted trees. Dakota slowed further, observing the people in the settlement. There were traders, hunters, and families trying to eke out a life in the harsh terrain. But Dakota noticed something else: tension simmering beneath the surface. Disputes unresolved, secrets whispered behind doors. The town carried the same unease that he felt in Red Mesa. Pain, fear, and suspicion had a way of following him, and it had now intertwined with Elara's shadowed past. They entered the settlement cautiously. Elara felt the eyes of townsfolk on her, their judgment quiet but palpable. She had grown used to it. It was a part of her existence, the way people saw brokenness and either pitied or avoided it. Dakota, too, was accustomed to the weight of suspicion. His reputation as an Apache warrior preceded him, though many could not understand the man behind the legend. Together, they were a combination that intrigued and unsettled those around them. Dakota's attention was drawn to a figure at the edge of the settlement, a man named Grayson. His eyes flicked toward Dakota with a mixture of recognition and wariness. Grayson had dealings with Corvin, and his loyalty was fluid, swayed by fear or opportunity. He moved as if weighing whether to intervene, whether to warn Corvin or confront Dakota himself. Dakota recognized the tension immediately. The valley was no longer just a place to pass through. It had become a stage where multiple players awaited their moves. Elara stayed close to Dakota, sensing the undercurrents of threat. She had faced danger before, but this was different. This was strategy and patience, calculation and deception. She realized with a sinking feeling that Corvin's presence was more than immediate danger. It was a shadow over their journey, a reminder that their promise, fragile as it was, could be tested at any moment. As the day wore on, Dakota and Elara discovered more about the valley and its people. They met a healer named Sable, an older woman with knowledge of herbs and survival, whose reputation for discretion and loyalty was known throughout the settlement. Sable became an ally, offering guidance and insight, warning them of forces beyond the valley that were already moving toward them. She spoke of travelers who carried news, some of it false, some dangerous, and how patience and vigilance were sometimes the only weapons that could protect those who could not fight openly. Elara was fascinated by Sable's strength and wisdom. She recognized in the healer a reflection of the resilience she had tried to cultivate in herself. And Dakota, though stoic and reserved, allowed himself a measure of trust in Sable's guidance. Knowing that allies were rare in a world where danger lurked behind every ridge and shadow, that night, as they camped just outside the settlement, Dakota sensed movement again. He was certain now that Corvin had not yet acted, but he could feel the careful observation, the plotting, the patience. Dakota did not speak of his past encounters with Corvin, nor of the times he had survived ambushes and betrayal. Elara did not ask, though she could see the tension etched in his jaw, the alertness in his amber eyes. They shared the same silent understanding. Trust, when placed, was fragile, and danger was patient. The tension built further the next morning when a rider appeared on the ridge overlooking the valley. Dakota recognized the figure immediately. It was Corvin. He did not descend, did not signal, did not speak. He simply watched, waiting for a sign of weakness, waiting to test their bond and patience. Dakota and Elara moved with deliberate calm, aware that their every choice would be scrutinized by someone whose patience matched their own. Elara found herself questioning everything she had believed about safety, loyalty, and survival. She had learned that trust was costly, but with Dakota, she felt the possibility that some promises might endure, even in a world filled with shadows. And yet, Corvin's presence reminded her that nothing was guaranteed, that every choice carried weight, and that silence sometimes carried more threat than any weapon. Throughout the valley, rumors began to spread about Dakota and Elara. whispered in marketplaces, around hearths, and along the edges of camps. Some spoke of the Apache warrior who had arrived mysteriously, some of the woman who carried grief as if it were armor. Others spoke of the quiet promise between them, though no one fully understood it. These whispers added another layer of tension, for in a world like theirs, attention could be as dangerous as any foe. Dakota's and Elira's days blended into careful observation, cautious travel, and moments of reflection. The valley itself seemed to test them, offering both shelter and challenge, teaching lessons in patience, resilience, and the strength of connection. And always the shadow of Corvin loomed, patient, silent, calculating. A reminder that their journey was far from over, that the promise they had made silently would face trials neither could yet foresee. By the time they reached the edge of the valley, the sun hung low again, the shadows stretching across the land. They paused, looking back at the settlement and the canyon, at the ridge where Corvin had watched, and at the path ahead, uncertain and full of danger. The bond between them had deepened, strengthened by shared struggle and quiet trust, yet the tension had not eased. Every sound carried warning, every shadow hinted at threat, and every step forward was a gamble with fate itself. As night fell once more, the wind whispered across the plains, carrying the echoes of past battles, of broken promises, of dangers yet unseen. Dakota and Elira settled near a stream, the water reflecting the pale moonlight, and both felt the weight of anticipation pressing down. The world around them was alive, attentive, and patient. And somewhere, watching from the ridges, Corvin smiled faintly, knowing that the real challenge had only just begun. The plains had claimed many, but not yet them. The silent promise that bound Takate and Elira together remained unbroken, yet fragile as glass. And the shadows, patient and cunning, waited for the first crack. The moon hung low over the valley, casting long silver streaks across the plains. Dakota and Elira moved quietly through the shadowed terrain, each step measured, each sound amplified in the stillness of night. The fire from the settlement they had left behind was now just a faint glow on the horizon, but the sense of being watched remained. Tokota's amber eyes swept across the ridges, catching every movement, noting every detail. He could feel the presence of Corvin, patient, calculating, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The air itself seemed to hum with anticipation, as if the plains had grown conscious of what was coming. Elira walked close, her fingers brushing against the strap of her satchel, a small comfort amid the rising tension. She had learned to read Tokota's silences, his subtle shifts, the tightening of his jaw, or the slight narrowing of his eyes. Each gesture spoke volumes, and she had come to trust them more than words.
Hey!
"Do you feel it?" she asked quietly, her voice barely rising above the whisper of the wind. Dakota did not answer immediately. He listened first, attuning himself to the faintest sound of movement in the grasses. The snap of a twig, the whisper of wind carrying something more than dust. Finally he spoke, his voice low, deliberate. He's closer than before. "Corvin does not rush. He waits, watches, tests. We must do the same." The valley grew narrower as they advanced, the hills pressing in from either side, leaving only a thin trail along the rocky floor. The terrain was difficult, forcing them to move slowly, but it offered vantage points, places to hide, and routes to retreat if necessary. Takota's experience guided their path, his knowledge of the land as precise as any map. He had grown up moving through spaces like this, places where the line between survival and death was razor thin, and every decision mattered. Elira's heart raced with anticipation and fear. She had followed Tokota for days, learning to rely on instincts that were not entirely her own. But she could feel the weight of danger pressing closer. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every sound a warning. She realized that what had begun as a journey through memory and trust had become a test of courage and resolve. And in that tension, she felt a strange exhilaration and awareness that survival, and perhaps hope, demanded bravery beyond anything she had known. They paused near a small outcropping of rocks, and Tokota signaled for silence. The wind shifted again, carrying a faint familiar scent, smoke, metal, and something unmistakably human. Corvin had moved closer. Takota's muscles tensed, a predator ready to strike or defend, his mind calculating every angle. He had faced ambushes before, But the difference now was the presence of Alara. Her safety was his responsibility, and the silent promise they shared made every threat more urgent, every decision heavier. The valley seemed to hold its breath as they moved forward. Birds and small creatures fled at their approach, sensing danger that went beyond instinct. Toka and Alara remained calm, their movements deliberate, but the air around them crackled with tension. They knew that the coming confrontation would test everything they had learned. Every lesson, every survival skill honed through years of hardship. As they neared a narrow pass, the first sign of Corvin appeared. Shadow detached itself from the ridgeline, moving silently, almost imperceptibly. Tokuda's hand went to the knife at his belt, but he did not make a sound. Lara instinctively dropped to a crouch, her eyes fixed on the ridge above. The figure paused, studying them, and for a moment, the world seemed suspended in time. Every heartbeat, every breath, carried weight. Corvin's voice finally cut through the stillness, cold, controlled, and deliberate. "Akoda," he said, the single word carrying both acknowledgement and threat. "I've been watching. I wondered if you would bring her here, if you would honor that silent promise." Tokuda's jaw tightened, his gaze never leaving the shadowed figure. "You've waited long enough, Corvin. The plains are not yours to command." The tension escalated as Corvin stepped into a patch of moonlight, his eyes glinting with calculation. He was neither hurried nor reckless. Every step he took seemed designed to provoke, to test, to make Dakota react. Alara's fingers gripped her satchel strap tighter, the knife inside a cold reassurance. She realized now how fragile their position was, how easily one misstep could turn this night into disaster. But the valley itself seemed to sense the importance of what was about to happen. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of dust and rock, of wild sage and distant fire. Shadows lengthened and shifted, playing tricks on the eyes. Tokuda's mind raced through every scenario, every possible move, yet he remained still, poised. He had faced threats before, but none with the stakes as personal as this one. This was not just about survival. It was about protecting the fragile trust between him and Alara, about keeping a promise that neither could afford to break. Corvin smiled faintly, a cruel twist that did not reach his eyes. "You trust her," he said. More observation than question. "You trust too easily, Tokuda. Strength can be measured, but trust can be weaponized." Alara felt the words like a chill across her skin. She had been strong. She had survived. But she realized that the true test was not just her courage, but the courage to be vulnerable, to trust someone in a world designed to betray. She looked at Tokuda, seeing the calm determination in his gaze, feeling the weight of his promise to protect her. For the first time, she understood that their bond was more than survival. It was defiance against the darkness around them, a rebellion against fear itself. Corvin shifted, circling slowly, his eyes never leaving them. "Do you think the plains favor you?" he continued. "But every land has its master, and every master has his patience. You will learn that soon enough." Tokuda remained silent, his stance unyielding. He did not underestimate Corvin, nor did he fear him. He had faced violence and deceit, had survived betrayal and loss. But now, with Alara beside him, the stakes were different. The silent promise between them was no longer just a bond, it was a force, fragile but undeniable, one that could not be broken by threats alone. Alara's heart pounded as she watched the dance of shadows between the ridges. She had followed Tokuda across the plains, learning to move with him, to anticipate danger, to trust instincts that were at once her own and his. But now, confronted directly with the embodiment of threat Corvin himself, she felt a new understanding settle over her. Trust required courage, and courage demanded action. She would have to fight, not just for herself, but for the bond they shared, for the promise they had forged in silence. The moonlight reflected off the knife at Tokuda's belt, off the folds of Alara's coat, casting fleeting, sharp highlights across the valley floor. Every shadow could conceal a movement. Every whisper of wind could be a signal. The plains seemed alive with anticipation, a silent witness to the confrontation that was about to unfold. Tokuda finally spoke, his voice calm but firm, carrying across the narrow pass. "We are not yours to test, Corvin. This land, these people, this promise, it is not yours to control. You can wait, you can watch, but do not think we will falter." Corvin paused, as if weighing the words, measuring the resolve in Tokota's stance, the determination in Alara's eyes. For a moment, silence reigned, and the valley seemed suspended in time. Then, without a word, he melted back into the shadows, leaving only the echo of his presence. A reminder that the coming hours would demand every ounce of skill, every shred of courage they possessed. Tokota exhaled slowly, glancing at Alara. "The calm is dangerous," he said. "He waits for impatience. We cannot give him that." Alara nodded, feeling the weight of what lay ahead. The night was not over. Corvin's threat had not passed. The promise between them had been strengthened, yes, but the true test, the one that would push them to their limits, was still to come. The wind carried the sound of distant rocks tumbling, of a coyote's lonely cry, and the valley seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the storm that was inevitable. Together, Tokota and Alara moved deeper into the pass, their shadows stretching long across the rocky floor. Each step forward was deliberate, each glance a silent communication. The plains watched, the ridges waited, and Corvin, patient as always, remained in the shadows, preparing for the moment when the promise they had forged in silence would face its ultimate trial. The night carried on, heavy with anticipation. Kota's hand hovered near his knife, Ilara's fingers gripping her satchel. Both aware that the coming hours would decide more than survival, they would decide whether trust, courage, and silent promises could endure in a world ruled by shadow, fear, and relentless testing. The tension was absolute. Every heartbeat, every whisper of wind, every shift of shadow brought them closer to the moment where their lives and the promise that bound them would be tested as never before. The first light of dawn crept over the ridges, painting the valley in soft amber and gold. The night's tension had not dissipated completely, but Tokota and Alara could feel a subtle shift in the air. The plains were quiet now, almost reverent, as though holding their breath after the storm of shadows and threats that had loomed over them. Tokota's amber eyes scanned the horizon one last time, noting the empty ridges and the absence of the silent watcher who had haunted their journey. Corvin had vanished into the distance, patient still, but ultimately unable to break the bond that had grown stronger with every trial. Ilara exhaled slowly, her body relaxing as the sun's warmth touched her face. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel a glimmer of hope. "It's over," she whispered, though she knew the plains were never truly without danger. Chokota's gaze softened as he looked at her, a rare moment of vulnerability passing between them. "Everything," he said quietly, "but the shadow that followed us has moved on. For now, we are free." They began to descend the valley together, their steps slower, unburdened by the constant vigilance that had defined the previous days. The small settlement they had passed through earlier welcomed them not with suspicion, but with curiosity and cautious respect. News of the Apache warrior and the woman who had journeyed with him spread quietly, and the whispers that had once carried doubt now carried a sense of admiration. They were no longer simply survivors, they had become figures of resilience, symbols of what courage and trust could achieve even in a harsh, unforgiving land. Tokota led Alara to the edge of a stream that had been their refuge during the darkest hours. The water shimmered in the morning light, clear and untainted, reflecting not only the sky, but the faces of the two who had endured so much. He knelt first, cupping the cool water in his hands, drinking slowly, savoring the moment of peace. Alara followed, letting the water run over her fingers, feeling the purity of life itself after nights filled with fear and uncertainty. It was a simple act, but one that symbolized more than survival. It was the first step toward healing, toward reclaiming pieces of themselves that had been lost to pain and solitude. As they sat together by the stream, Ilara finally spoke of her past, the grief she had carried in silence for so long. "I thought I was broken beyond repair," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "I thought trust was impossible. But you proved me wrong. You didn't ask for anything, yet you gave me everything I didn't know I needed." Tokota reached out, placing a hand gently over hers. "We are not whole because the world is kind," he said softly. "We are whole because we choose to face it together. The promise we made, silent though it was, binds us in ways no threat or shadow could sever. And now it is time to live with that promise fully, not just in fear of losing it." The days that followed were a mixture of quiet labor and subtle celebrations. They returned to the settlement, offering aid where it was needed, helping rebuild damaged structures and teaching the townsfolk lessons of survival that went beyond weapons and fences. Lara discovered a new strength within herself, tending to the wounded, learning the old healing ways from Sable, and finding joy in the small victories that each day offered. Tokoda, ever the guardian, remained vigilant, but his focus shifted from survival alone to nurturing the fragile peace that now existed between them and the world around them. Corvin was never seen again, though the memory of his presence lingered like a shadow across the ridges. Tokoda had prepared for confrontation, for the moment when violence might erupt, but in the end, it was patience, courage, and the strength of their bond that had kept them safe. The valley itself seemed to recognize the change. The wind carried a gentler hum, the grasses swayed without the tension of unseen threat, and the rivers sparkled with a clarity that mirrored the hope blooming in their hearts. Ilara's transformation was subtle but profound. Where once she had walked with hesitation and fear, now she moved with confidence and purpose. She spoke with the townsfolk, offered guidance to the younger women and children, and shared the lessons of resilience she had learned on the journey with Tokoda. Her grief, while never erased, had been tempered by love, trust, the realization that even broken souls could find strength in connection. Tokoda, too, allowed himself moments of reflection. He had lived most of his life in solitude, carrying the weight of battles both fought and avoided. But with Ilara, he discovered that strength was not measured by survival alone, but by the capacity to protect, to trust, and to nurture something beyond himself. The silent promise that had first united them became a living bond, visible in their shared actions, in their protective vigilance, and in the quiet moments of intimacy that needed no words. The plains, once a symbol of isolation and threat, now felt expansive and alive with possibility. Tokoda and Ilara rode across them together, the wind carrying their laughter, their conversation, and the knowledge that they had survived not just the dangers of men, but the ghosts of their own pasts. Every ridge, every canyon, every whisper of the wind seemed to celebrate their endurance, their courage, and the promise that had brought them together. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of crimson over the horizon, they paused on a high ridge overlooking the valley below. Tokoda dismounted and gestured for Ilara to stand beside him. The plains stretched endlessly, a mixture of gold and shadow, a living testament to the battles that had been fought and the peace that could now exist. "We have faced the shadows," he said, voice calm but carrying weight. "We have faced fear, loss, and the cruelty of those who would see us broken, but we endure. Now, and that is proof that even the most broken souls can find light." Ilara leaned against him, feeling the warmth of his presence and the security it offered. "I never thought I could trust again," she said softly. "Never thought someone could see me, truly see me, and stay. But here you are, and here I am, and I think maybe finally we can be whole together." They remained on the ridge as night fell, the stars emerging one by one, countless and unwavering. The vast expanse of the plains no longer felt threatening, but alive with possibility, a canvas for the life they could now build together. The silent promise that had united them had carried through every shadow, every threat, every test of patience and courage. And though the world would continue to be harsh and unpredictable, they had proven that together they could face anything. The story of Tokoda and Ilara, of an Apache warrior and a broken soul, became part of the whispers carried across the plains, not of fear, but of hope, not of despair, but of resilience. Those who had doubted them, who had whispered of shadows and failure, began to recognize the power of trust, courage, and commitment. The valley that had once been a place of danger became a place of healing, community, and life renewed. In the quiet moments, when the wind moved softly through the grasses and the river reflected the rising sun, Tokoda and Ilara would sit together, hand in hand, sharing the unspoken bond that had first drawn them together. They had learned that love was not just a feeling, but an action, a promise lived day by day, in protection, in trust, in shared struggle and quiet triumph. And in that promise, they found not just survival, but joy, peace, and the rarest gift of all, a sense of belonging and purpose in a world that had once seemed unyielding. The plains remained vast, wild, and unpredictable. Corvin's shadow lingered only as memory, a reminder that patience and cunning could not conquer the resilience born of true connection. Dakota and Alara, bound by the silent promise that had first united them, moved forward with confidence, their lives intertwined, their hearts strong, their futures bright. They knew that challenges would come, as they always did, but they also knew that together, no threat was insurmountable, no shadow unbreakable. And so, beneath the endless sky of the plains, with the wind whispering through the tall grasses and the rivers singing softly over stone, Dakota and Alara rode side by side. Each step forward was a celebration of survival, of courage, and of the unspoken vow that had carried them through darkness into light. The silent promise had endured, unbroken, and with it, the chance for love, healing, and life renewed. The plains, once a land of shadows and uncertainty, had become a testament to hope, a reminder that even broken souls could find strength, and that a promise made in silence could unite hearts forever. And in that vast wild land, Dakota and Alara finally understood what it meant to be truly free.